In preparation for the conference and as part of the ICPT Beyond 2013 review process in the UNECE region, 3 thematic expert meetings were convened by UNFPA together with UNECE. The first discussant, Dr. Agnieszka Chłoń-Domińczak, was part of the thematic meeting that discussed population dynamics and sustainable development and will introduce the results of that meeting. Dr. Agnieszka Chłoń-Domińczak works at the Warsaw School of Economics, Institute of Statistics and Development, and the Institute of Educational Research. Previously, she has worked at the Office of the Government Plenipotentiary for Social Security Reform in Poland as a consultant for the World Bank and the OECD, and for the national government as a department director at the Ministry of Labor and Social Policy, and then as Undersecretary of State in the Ministry of Labor and Social Policy. Please take the floor.
Thank you very much. Indeed, many of the topics of the discussion that we had in March in Vienna have been covered by Professor Lutz in his presentation. I would like to focus on 2 points that we have discussed related to population dynamics. One is indeed on how we can perceive investment in human capital, and second, what are the relationships between demographic change, economic growth, and consumption. I would like to start from very classics, which is The Wealth of Nations of Adam Smith, and point out that the issue of labor or human capital was something that was already key in the economic policy almost a century ago. I mean, more than a century ago when Adam Smith was writing his Wealth of Nations, where skills were also mentioned. So it is an important part of our development, how we perceive human capital, how we use the resources which are in us, in human beings, and how we invest in them. Indeed, we observe that life expectancy is changing, and also if we look at the structure of the world population by life expectancy, we see that more and more people live longer and longer, which is a great achievement of our populations and our lives. However, it is distributed differently across regions, and here I would like to point out to some of the population projections which use more traditional measures of ages than those proposed by Professor Lutz, but nevertheless we can see that there's a huge difference between developed economies in Europe and those countries which are from the Central and Eastern Europe. This is for the EU 27. And we do observe that many of those countries that will observe largest population declines over the next 5 decades or so are from Central and Eastern Europe. And these are also the same countries that will observe one of the highest growths of shares of people aged 65 and more in the population, even taking into account the fact that life expectancies in those countries are lower than in developed countries. They also have lower GDP per capita or GDP levels in general. So basically we may say, and this is a quotation after Professor Robert Holtzman, that says that who said, I believe, first that those countries will become demographically old before they were or they are economically rich. So many of the countries, especially in Central and Eastern Europe, will face at the same time population aging and lower levels of economic development. This was shown by Professor Lutz, so I will not focus on that. There are 2 points for consideration that I have picked from the topics that we've discussed in Vienna. Population change and human capital development. The countries really substitute quantity for quality measured by education or skills levels. And the second is the consumption patterns that we observe with change in the population structure. We've seen already that the levels of education and the levels of the numbers of people that have relatively high skills change with time, but also we observe that with the aging of the baby boom generation, there will be a change of the entire age structure of the working age population. So workers aged 50 plus will become actually a majority of all workers. That means that those that have relatively lower educational development will still become relatively high share of the labor force. That means that investing in young, investing in increasing qualifications, increasing educational levels of young probably is not enough. We should think how we can invest in development of human capital across all ages, and the answer is relatively simple. We should think about lifelong learning and think how we can increase participations in various forms of learning, not only the formal one, but also non-formal learning or informal learning to improve the human capital. The question is whether it really happens, and whether, if we look at lifelong learning participation, can we see improving the overall level of human capital, and what is more important, reducing some of inequalities in human capital distribution that happen across age and within cohorts. The notion is that education and lifelong learning policy should focus not only on the young, but also on adults and those even at the age of 50 plus, so that educational activity can support overall working age activity. Lifelong learning is needed also because technological changes and globalization change demand for competencies, change demand for skills. In order to become competitive, to remain competitive at the labor market, we need IT skills. We need skills that we didn't have 10 or 20 years ago. We need to maintain them, we need to develop them. Competencies that are acquired during formal education tend to depreciate in time. They actually depreciate very quickly. It turns out that sometimes some parts of knowledge that were taught even 5 years ago when people started their educational programs at universities are already outdated when they finish, when they graduate. The skills gap that result from formal education can be to some extent ameliorated by lifelong learning. If we compare some indicators that relate to demographic development, like fertility and also participation in education and training, we see that there's some, well, we can't say it's a causality, but it seems that countries that have low fertility levels don't think also about investing in human capital. So there's a, if we think about whether countries converge as far as fertility levels, or those that have low fertility levels try to compensate through higher investment in human capital, it doesn't happen. So it's actually the notion that Professor Lutz is mentioning is very important, but if we look at the reality, it's one of the largest policy challenges that we observe. So if we look at participation in formal and non-formal learning for those that completed their educational history, so those from 25 to 50 to 64-year-olds, we also do observe that with age, educational activity tends to go down. But there's also a huge difference between countries. So in Sweden, as you can see, young people, 80% of young people do participate in some form of learning. In Romania, it is slightly more than 10%. And if we go to the oldest age group, 55 to 64, that gap is from around 60% to, well, less than 5%. So there's a huge gap between countries, but again, with age, educational activity decreases. Educational activity is also important if we look at the employment rates of, especially of older workers. So we do see some effect that those countries that invest in maintaining the human capital through lifelong learning also tend to have higher participation rates at the labor market. So there is some kind of a virtuous circle of educational activity, labor market participation, and overall social policy development that can be seen from that. So summarizing that point, we see that countries with strongest changes in the age composition actually do not seem to compensate those changes through quality improvements, investment in lifelong learning. Education inequalities between generations or groups with different educational attainment. This is something I did not show in the graph, but if we look at lifelong learning participation by educational level, those that are highly educated participate much more in lifelong learning compared to those with low educational levels. So the differences that emerge at the beginning of employment activity or labor market activity of generations tend to even increase with time and with age when they participate at the labor market and learn or not learn. With changing age structure, lifelong learning policies should also focus on older age groups, as well as those with lower formal qualifications, so that indeed the human capital levels tend to be higher in those groups. During the meeting, we discussed that demographic development actually, through economic development and consumption, affects overall economic development. Here I have a very blurred picture which shows patterns of labor income and consumption over age groups that were developed in according to national transfer account methodology developed by Professors Lonely and Andy Mason, at which we can see that where there are some similarities as far as first consumption patterns and labor income. This is the typical life course approach, but we see that there is much more divergence in consumption levels between countries than if we look at the consumption patterns of young children and youth. There's also a very typical pattern of labor income, but when we look at where those lines actually cross, we see that consumption and labor income, or consumption starts to exceed labor income in different countries at different age levels. So adding to the potential world of indicators, we may also think about the age from which we count population parts or ages as those that are less productive, from those ages when people start to consume more than they produce as far as labor income. And that also probably would lead to a slightly different pattern and different map than seen by an indicator proposed by Professor Lutz. But it also means that if we combine those consumption patterns and labor income patterns with different structures of population, there is a different overall consumption profile. So if we look at Germany, for example, we see that majority of a lot of consumption actually comes from the older parts of population, while if we take very young population like Indian, a lot of consumption is generated by those of children. So basically age structure affects very significantly consumption models, which can be seen from the perspective of using the second demographic dividend. That means those that are in the older age groups, if they accumulated wealth during their working lives, they can actually stimulate consumption that leads to parts of growth. But again, it can happen only if those countries were economically rich before they became demographically old. If it is not the case, then of course the problem emerges. So Conclusions, demographic change will impose a redefinition of economic and social policies, and definitely looking at coherent policy packages that takes that into account is very important, and example of the social investment package recently proposed in the EU is one of such examples. The scale of adjustments is unprecedented. We didn't survive this kind of demographic change that we observe right now ever before. There is a divide regarding demographic dividend, and C countries are definitely not those that will benefit from it. And that means that demographic change increases the risk of divergences within countries, within regions, and globally. And that also means that we have very little room for policy inefficiencies. And it is important that economic, social, labor market, educational, any kind of policies are very well coordinated to allow this margin to be very, very narrow. Thank you.
Thank you, Agnieszka, for your substantial plaidoyer for continuing learning as a challenge for individuals as well as for societies. And we now move to our second discussant, Dr. Lidija Kozarcanin. She is head of the Department for Social Research and Development at the Republic Institute for Social Protection in Serbia. She is also the vice president of the Gerontological Society of Serbia, the secretary of the Government Council for Aging and Old Age, and a member of the UNECE Working Group on Aging. Lidija is the author of a number of published reports and scientific articles, manuals, and monographies dealing with aging and social protection issues. She has over 10 years of experience in international cooperation and comparison of social welfare policies and social services for aging populations, and I ask you to take the floor.
First, I'd like to say hello to everyone, to all distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, to my colleagues and friends, and I want to say many thanks for all of you who contribute to this topic I will speak today here. So the topic of my discussion is aging and migration as challenges for sustainable development in Southeastern European countries. We are talking about Albania, Bosnia and Herzegovina, former Republic Macedonia, Yugoslavian Republic Macedonia, Montenegro, Serbia and Turkey. So in brief, I will talk about two parts of this presentation. First, about the main characteristic and consequences of aging and migration phenomena in Southeast European countries. And second, I will say something about the best policies and practices we recommended, researchers, policymakers, best practitioners, which aging population and international migration could turn in favor or make laws less influential on sustainable development of these countries. So even the data we have is not complete, like missing census or some other data. Results of researches and analyses of practices and policies shows us two main things. First, that aging cannot be avoided. So lower birth rates and increasing lifespan made aging the most important demographic change in whole UNECE region and also in Southeast European countries. And second, in Southeast European countries exists large negative net of international migration. So we are talking about migration out that crosses international borders and influenced on country level demographic change. So we see here one of the main indicators that shows us what situation is now. That is median population age, that divided population of country on two equal parts, older and younger, then it is median age. So you see the median age in Southeast Europe and the median age for whole region. You can see also from excellent projects that made Wittgenstein Center for Demography and Global Human Capital, that in the future that the differences between Southeastern Europe and UNECE region total will be smaller, but we have to wait for a long time for accomplish that situation. And also we have an indicator of life expectancy at birth by sex. So we could see situation in total UNECE region and Southeast European countries when we are talking about men and life expectancy of men at birth. We can see also a little period before. We see 10 years from 2000 to 2010, how the life expectancy grow. But in the end, we still, in 2050, can see the difference we have in 2050, even almost the same as at the beginning. If you look closely, it's a very, very slow increase. So we could see that indicators also on the level of countries in Southeast Europe. And I want to point out here big differences we have. Look at the Turkey and the median population age, and in the other hand, most parts of Serbia, when we have a population with median age 42.7. That's a big difference for one region. So in the other hand, in the right side, you could see that life expectancy at birth by sex is also different in countries, with Albania on the top with the biggest life expectancy for men and women. In the same time, that is the population which is very young. So what are the main characteristics of population in Southeast European countries? We have two opposite sides, countries with younger population on one side, and in the other side we have older population countries. Turkey and Albania have younger population and also slower aging process, and in the other side, in the most parts of Serbia, Montenegro, and Macedonia, we have older populations and faster aging process. So now we have to say something about international migration in Southeast European countries. In the last decade, in all that region, that sub-region, the volume of migration stock shows that international migration rate slowly decreases, which is good news, because we have 3% international migrants in 2000 year and 2.6% in 2010. So in one decade, it is decreased, even is very small and very slow. In whole UNECE region, only Southeast European countries and countries from Central Asia still have negative migration net. But also we could see decreasing, which is very good in that comparing of two periods, 1996-2000 and 2006-2010, we saw that the number of emigrants is 2.8 times less. And in the end, I have to say that the most important fact is also that tertiary educated rate of tertiary educated people, which are migrants, is very high, almost 8% of the total working populations. For example, I will say a few data about the international migration in Serbia. In 2011, according to our census, we had a loss of population 4.15%. And beside the negative rate of population growth, international migration has been recognized as one of the aging accelerating factor. And since 1992, we have that process of depopulation in our country. Every census signified that. And in 2011 census also, we discovered that 4.1% of population were registered to live abroad. But our estimations are even higher, because that is only information we could got in a census. Where you have all families gone to abroad, you cannot have the information, so estimates are higher. In average, migrants are 10 years younger and much better educated compared to the total population. And what will be the main characteristic of international migration in Southeast European region? In relation to total population, we could say that Serbia, Macedonia, and Albania experienced massive international migration. Migration losses have negative effects. All researchers pointed out that that negative effects are on population aging, which is accelerating faster, family support, which are lower, and family losing structure, productivity and sustainability of development, of course, as a final consequence. And what is also very important, that remittances by migrant workers have supporting role only if they are used in developing purposes. Contributions lost through migration of educated young adults cannot be remitted by investments in physical capital or infrastructure, and I'm sorry, but that is the most of our practice. And some sentences about messages and best policy recommendations. So we heard already, population aging is not a threat for sustainable development if appropriate social policy is established. And the main thing are investments in education and health. So what are the goals? The goals are educated, healthier, active, and longer living older population. Also, it is very important to develop awareness that today older people have much more potential than previous generations. And what is of most importance for me as a man from social protection, that support to older, most vulnerable groups must be provided. Reducing poverty, services for persons with disease or disabilities, decrease the number of abused and discriminated people. And few key messages for the end. Education and training, I'm sure, could win against ageism. Collecting more aging-related data is very important for better policies and better implementing practices. Securing a minimal income for poor older people, especially women, I think it's of most importance, and provide equal access to social and health security and humanitarian aid also, ensuring long-term care services in community, and last but not least, empowering cooperation in international policies to mitigate or overcome international migration losses. Thank you for your attention.